Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. It was a few years back when I found myself reeling from a painful breakup that had completely blindsided me. My now ex-girlfriend Claire and I had been together for over 5 years. We'd built a life together, shared an apartment, talked endlessly about marriage and children. Then out of the blue she said she needed space. Before I knew it, she had moved out and cut off all contact. The silence was deafening. I was devastated. I wandered through each day feeling numb and lost in my own home. Every corner held a memory. Her coffee mug still sat in the cabinet. Her shampoo remained in the shower, a cruel reminder of what I'd lost. The bed felt enormous and cold without her warmth beside me. I couldn't eat, couldn't focus on work, couldn't think about anything except the massive hole she'd left in my life. Friends tried to help, but their well-meaning advice felt hollow. Nothing could fill the emptiness. After 3 weeks of this torment, I knew I needed to escape. I needed distance from the apartment, from the city, from everything that reminded me of Claire. With deer hunting season approaching, I decided some time alone in the familiar woods of my family's sprawling rural property would be good for me. Ever since I was a young boy, deer hunting in these woods during the fall had been a beloved tradition passed down from my father and grandfather. The rituals of the hunt had always brought me peace and clarity. I needed that now more than ever. I headed out alone early one brisk November morning, just as the sun began to peek over the mountains nearby. The air was sharp and clean, biting at my lungs with each breath. Frost crunched under my boots as I made my way into the dense forest. A heavy silence hung over the woods as I hiked through the stands of evergreens, their branches drooping with the weight of morning dew. It was opening day of rifle season, but I wasn't particularly concerned about bagging anything. I just wanted space to gather my troubled thoughts, to breathe air that didn't smell like her perfume. After about an hour of steady hiking, my legs burning from the climb, I arrived at a clearing on a ridge which offered an incredible view of the surrounding snow-capped peaks. This had been my grandfather's favorite spot. He'd brought me here when I was barely tall enough to see over the tall grass, teaching me to read the wind, to watch for movement, to respect the animals we hunted. I sat against a gnarled old tree, listening to the sounds of nature around me. Birds called from the canopy. Somewhere in the distance, water trickled over rocks. For the first time in a long while, I felt the knots in my shoulders begin to loosen. Out of nowhere, a small herd of deer bounded through the clearing down the ridge, their white tails flashing in the morning light. They were fleeing something, their movements panicked and erratic. I glanced up in time to see a beautiful buck emerge from the tree line, his impressive antlers crowning his head like a natural crown. My hunting instincts kicked in automatically. I slowly raised my rifle, steadied my breathing the way grandfather had taught me, took careful aim and felled the buck with one clean shot. The crack of the rifle echoed across the valley. I took a moment to approach the fallen animal, both proud and thankful for the kill. This was meat that would fill my freezer for months. This was connection to something primal and honest. Then I began the familiar work of field dressing it, my hands moving with practiced efficiency. Skinning and cleaning the deer brought back fond memories of doing this same work as a young boy alongside my father and grandfather after successful hunts. They had taught me how to do it properly, how to make clean cuts, how not to waste any part of the animal. I could almost hear their voices now, their patient instructions mixing with laughter and stories. The physical work felt good, honest and straightforward in a way my relationship with Claire never had been toward the end. The sun was starting to set by the time I finished the work, my hands stained red despite my gloves. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and gripped the deer's antlers firmly. I started the arduous process of dragging the heavy animal back toward my truck, which I'd parked several miles away at the edge of the property earlier that morning. The weight of the large buck made for slow going over the uneven, rocky ground. Within 20 minutes, my breathing grew labored and my muscles burned from the constant exertion. As I stepped carefully over fallen logs and navigated around thick patches of brambles, I was grateful I'd worn my sturdy hunting boots. Sharp rocks and hidden roots threatened to turn my ankles with every step. I frequently paused to rest, leaning against trees and taking long swigs of water from my canteen, feeling the cold liquid soothe my parched throat. During one such break, I checked my watch and was surprised to see a couple of hours had already passed. The sun had dropped below the ridgeline, bathing the sky in brilliant shades of pink and orange that slowly bled into purple. Though I still had quite a bit of distance to cover, there was enough light left to make it back safely. With renewed determination, I wrapped the deer's antlers once more in my gloved hands and continued my march through the deepening shadows. As I trudged along, dragging the deer behind me and leaving a trail through the fallen leaves, I heard the distinct snap of a branch somewhere off in the trees to my right. I spun around immediately, my senses suddenly on high alert, scanning the darkening woods carefully. I found nothing but shadows stretching long between the tree trunks. Unease crept into my chest, but I shook my head and kept walking. Probably just a squirrel or a bird settling in for the night, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave. Before long, I heard more odd noises from the dense trees around me. Twigs cracking with sharp reports. Leaves rustling in patterns that didn't match the gentle breeze. It sounded disturbingly like something was walking on 2 feet, keeping pace with me, staying just out of sight. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to remain calm. It was probably just a curious black bear, I reasoned. We'd had a few sightings on the property over the years, though they usually avoided humans. Even so, I picked up my pace as much as the heavy deer would allow, suddenly very eager to get back to the safety of my truck. The noises continued, moving stealthily between the trees, always matching my speed. Too quiet and deliberate for a bear, I thought with growing anxiety. Bears were noisy, crashing through underbrush without care. This was something else, something that moved with purpose and intelligence. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of a fleeting shadow shifting behind a large pine tree. I whipped my head around, heart hammering, but caught only a blur of darkness disappearing into the thick brush. The deer carcass seemed to gain weight with every step, as if some invisible force was making it heavier, harder to move. As actual fear began to take firm hold in my gut, I wanted desperately to drop everything and run. But I could hardly manage a hobbling walk, weighted down by this deer and exhausted from hours of hiking. Whatever was stalking me stayed maddeningly out of direct sight, using the forest as cover with unsettling skill. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my temples. The snapping branches and rustling leaves followed my every move, never falling behind, never coming closer. The presence felt ominous, deliberate, even malevolent in a way I couldn't quite explain. This wasn't animal curiosity. This felt like something darker. I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that intelligent eyes were watching me struggle from the shadows, studying my every move. I thought of my rifle then, slung uselessly over my shoulder. I needed both hands to drag this deer, which left me completely defenseless if this unseen thing decided to attack. The realization sent ice-cold fear flooding through my veins. With no other option available, I summoned my last reserves of strength and forged ahead with grim determination, set on making it back to the truck before full nightfall descended. Just a little farther, I told myself repeatedly, trying desperately to ignore the creepy sounds paralleling me step for step. You're almost there. Keep moving. You might wonder why I didn't just drop the deer and confront my follower, or simply walk away from it and save myself. Fear is a strange thing. At the time, I felt both genuinely terrified and simultaneously silly for being scared. I had no idea what was out there. What if it really was nothing dangerous? What if I was just being paranoid? Plus, I knew I would be furious with myself for having killed this animal only to abandon it in the woods. My grandfather had always taught me to use as much of what I killed as possible, to honor the animal's sacrifice. Leaving it felt like a betrayal of everything he'd taught me. Then something happened that made my decision for me. A chillingly accurate deer call emanated from the trees directly behind me. So close I could have sworn I felt breath on my neck. The sound was a perfect, mocking imitation of an alarm call from a white-tailed deer, the sharp, repetitive bleat they make when warning others of danger. No natural creature could mimic that call so precisely. No human could make that sound without special equipment. Adrenaline flooded my system instantly as the terrifying implication sank in like a stone. This was no ordinary animal stalking me through the growing darkness. Something intelligent, something utterly wrong, was hunting me. My guts twisted with primordial fear that reached back to some ancient part of my brain, the part that remembered when humans were prey. The unseen creature grew more brazen after that mocking call, aggressively breaking larger branches as if to purposefully demonstrate its presence and power. It wanted me to know it was there. It wanted me to know I was being hunted. The message was clear and horrifying. This game could end any time it chose. I was being threatened. I was being toyed with like a cat plays with a wounded mouse before the final kill. Nearly delirious from exhaustion and terror, I channeled every last ounce of strength into dragging that deer at a frantic pace. My lungs screamed for air that wouldn't come fast enough. My legs wobbled and threatened to give out with each step. My hands had gone numb from gripping the antlers so tightly, but I was wholly desperately focused on reaching the safety of my truck ahead, pushing my body beyond any limit I'd known before. With the last dregs of daylight fading rapidly behind the trees, painting everything in shades of deep purple and black, I finally stumbled into the small clearing where my old pickup truck sat waiting. I had never been so grateful to see that beat-up vehicle in my entire life. I hurriedly loaded the heavy deer carcass into the truck bed, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it twice, as complete darkness enveloped the forest around me like a suffocating blanket. I jumped into the driver's seat, my hands still shaking violently as I fumbled to insert the key into the ignition. My fingers felt thick and clumsy. The woods behind me had gone deathly, unnaturally silent. No insects, no birds, no wind, but I could feel the presence of the predator with absolute certainty, watching from the tree line, waiting. As the engine finally roared to life, I said a grateful prayer to God that I would make it home alive. As I pulled away, tires spitting gravel, a horrific scream pierced the night air from somewhere deep in the black forest behind me. It wasn't an animal sound. It wasn't human either. It was something in between, something that shouldn't exist. The ghastly sound was filled with rage and frustration, echoing across the valley. Whatever this malevolent entity was, it was furious that I had escaped. I had been meant to die in those woods. I drove recklessly fast down the winding dirt road, away from that cursed place, one trembling hand on the wheel and the other gripping my rifle so tight my knuckles went white. When I finally arrived home, I leapt from the truck and raced around back to unload the animal before it could spoil. As I heaved its body from the truck bed, under the harsh glare of my porch light, my stomach dropped. The buck's head was completely gone, ripped clean off the neck by some tremendous force. The edges of the wound were ragged, torn rather than cut. Bone fragments jutted out at odd angles. It would have taken incredible strength to do this. When had it happened? How had I not noticed? The questions swirled in my mind as I stared at the mutilated carcass, unable to look away from the horror. In the days that followed, paranoia consumed me completely. The image of that mutilated deer carcass seemed seared permanently into my mind. I couldn't close my eyes without seeing it. I constantly felt watched, even in my own home. At the edge of our property, where the manicured lawn gave way to wild forest, I swore I could see shapes moving between the trees at dusk, dark figures that vanished when I looked directly at them. At night I would jolt awake, my heart racing, absolutely certain that thing was outside my window, peering in at me with inhuman eyes. Dark circles formed under my eyes. I lost weight. Friends expressed concern, but how could I explain? They'd think I'd lost my mind with grief over Claire. One morning, our family dog failed to greet me at the door as she usually did, tail wagging, eager for breakfast. I found the poor animal whimpering under the porch, pressed against the foundation. She'd been viciously mauled, deep claw marks across her side, chunks of fur torn out. But somehow she was still clinging to life, her eyes wide with terror. The vet said it looked like a bear attack, but I knew better. This was a message. This presence could easily strike at those I loved whenever it desired. One dreary morning, unable to bear the weight of this knowledge alone any longer, I worked up the courage to visit my grandfather. The old man had retired to a small place at the edge of town, not far from our family's property. I hadn't seen him in months, and I felt guilty that it took something so dire to prompt a visit. When I arrived, Grandpa looked pleasantly surprised to see me standing on his porch. He invited me in, and we caught up over strong black coffee at his worn kitchen table. Eventually, carefully, I broached the subject. I asked as casually as I could manage if he'd ever experienced anything odd while hunting near that ridge where he used to take me. Grandfather's weathered face darkened immediately. He stared silently into his coffee mug for several long, heavy moments before speaking. "You saw something out there, didn't you?" he asked gravely, his eyes meeting mine with terrible understanding. I nodded, ashamed to have brought up something that clearly troubled him deeply. But I had to know I wasn't insane. He leaned back in his chair with a heavy sigh that seemed to carry years of weight. Didn't want to believe it myself, he began slowly, choosing his words with care. But over the years things happened that I couldn't explain. Strange calls in the night that didn't match any animal I knew. An odd sense of being watched by something that meant harm. Couple of times while hauling a kill back I'd hear twigs snapping, leaves rustling right behind me, keeping perfect pace. It was exactly what I'd experienced. Every detail matched. Never actually saw anything though, Grandfather continued, his voice quiet. And I didn't want to believe that kind of evil could exist so close to home, in woods I'd known my whole life. So I convinced myself it was all my imagination, just an old man's mind playing tricks. But deep down I've always known the truth. There's something unnatural in those woods, something that shouldn't be there. I told him every chilling detail of my encounter. The sound of branches cracking, the precise mimicry of deer calls, the mutilated carcass, the scream in the darkness. He listened grimly, nodding in recognition of each horror. "I'm sorry," Grandpa said with deep regret when I finished. "I should have warned you. All these years I've been denying it, pretending it was nothing, but it's still out there." I changed the subject after that, not wanting to linger on something so distressing. After all, my grandfather's best years were behind him, and I didn't want to add to his burdens. We talked about better things. Family, old hunting stories, simpler times. It's been years now since that November day in the woods. I've never gone back to that ridge, never returned to hunt on our family's property. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I still hear that scream echoing in my memory. I'm still afraid it may be out there, lurking in the shadows of those woods, waiting for another hunter to wander into its territory. Maybe, hopefully, I'm just paranoid. Maybe grief and stress created phantoms in my mind that dark evening. But deep in my bones, in that ancient part of the brain that knows when something is watching, I know the truth. Whatever stalked me through those woods was real, and it's still there, patient and hungry, waiting in the darkness between the trees. The morning of June 15th, 2021 started like any other Saturday. I was 26 then, working a soul-crushing office job that left me craving adventure on weekends. My boyfriend Trevor and I had been dating for about 6 months, and outdoor activities had become our escape from the mundane routine of city life. We discovered hiking together early in our relationship, and it had become our thing, our way of connecting away from screens and stress. That particular Saturday, Trevor had been researching new trails online for weeks. He was the type who loved discovering hidden gems, places that weren't overrun with tourists and Instagram hikers. "I found this amazing spot," he had told me over coffee that morning, his eyes bright with excitement. "Crows Ridge State Park. It's about 45 minutes out of town, and hardly anyone knows about it yet." I remember being hesitant. Something about the name itself felt ominous, but I pushed the feeling aside. Trevor had good instincts about these things, and I trusted his judgment. Besides, I needed the fresh air and exercise after a particularly brutal week at work. We spent the morning packing our day packs with water bottles, energy bars, and basic first aid supplies. Trevor checked and double-checked our gear while I studied the weather forecast on my phone. Clear skies, 72 degrees, light winds, minus perfect hiking conditions. I pulled on my favorite hiking boots, the sturdy ones I'd broken in on countless trails, and laced them tight. The familiar ritual was comforting, preparing me for whatever adventure lay ahead. The drive out of the city was pleasant, winding through suburban neighborhoods that gradually gave way to farmland and then dense forest. Trevor drove while I navigated, watching the GPS as we turned off the main highway onto increasingly narrow country roads. The landscape grew wilder with each mile, thick stands of oak and maple pressing close to the asphalt. "This is really remote," I observed, noting how the houses had become sparse and then disappeared entirely. Cell service had dropped to 1 bar about 10 minutes ago. "That's what makes it perfect," Trevor replied, grinning. "No crowds, no noise. Just us and nature." We arrived at Crows Ridge State Park around noon, later than we'd planned due to hitting construction traffic on the highway. The parking area was smaller than I'd expected. Just a gravel lot with room for maybe 20 cars. Only 3 other vehicles were there, which seemed odd for such a beautiful Saturday. The park office was a small wooden structure that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Faded posters about leave no trace principles were taped to the windows, and a handwritten sign warned visitors about recent bear activity in the area. My stomach tightened at that detail, but Trevor seemed unfazed as he pushed through the creaky door. Inside, the office smelled of musty wood and old coffee. Behind the counter sat a park ranger who looked to be in his 60s, with weathered skin and tired eyes that suggested he'd seen more than his share of weekend adventurers. His name tag read Ranger Mills. "Afternoon," he said, looking up from a crossword puzzle. "You folks here for day hiking?" "Yes, sir," Trevor replied enthusiastically. "We're hoping to see the waterfall overlook. I read online that there's a great 6-mile loop trail." The ranger's expression shifted slightly, though I couldn't quite read what the change meant. He pulled out a faded trail map and spread it on the counter. "Well, there is a trail system back there," he said slowly. "But I'll be honest with you, it's not as well maintained as some of our other parks. Gets a bit confusing in places." He traced a route with his finger, highlighting the main trail in yellow marker. "Your best bet is to stick to this marked path. Don't deviate from it, no matter what. People have gotten turned around back there before." His eyes met mine, and I caught something that might have been concern. "How experienced are you two?" Trevor puffed up slightly. "Oh, we're experienced. We've done plenty of trails around the state. We know what we're doing." The ranger nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "Well, just remember, this isn't like the popular parks with clear signage every quarter mile. The trail markers are old and some are missing. If you start to feel unsure about where you are, turn back immediately. Don't try to push through and figure it out." I felt a chill despite the warm afternoon air, but Trevor was already folding the map and thanking the ranger. As we headed back outside, I glanced over my shoulder to see the old man watching us through the window, his expression unreadable. The trailhead was located behind the parking area, marked by a simple wooden sign that had seen better days. Waterfall Loop, 6 miles, was carved into the weathered wood, though the letters were faded and barely legible. A smaller sign below warned hikers to stay on marked trails and carry plenty of water. Trevor and I adjusted our packs and began walking. The initial part of the trail was everything we'd hoped for. Wide, well-defined, and clearly marked with blue blazes painted on trees every 50 yards or so. The forest was beautiful, with towering hardwoods creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns on the forest floor. For the first hour, everything was perfect. We chatted easily as we walked, pointing out interesting birds and wildflowers. The trail climbed gradually, and I felt the satisfying burn in my leg muscles that came with good exercise. Trevor was in his element, stopping occasionally to take photos of particularly scenic spots or identify different tree species. "This is exactly what we needed," I said, breathing in the clean forest air. The sounds of civilization had completely faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves, distant bird calls, and the rhythmic crunch of our boots on the trail. The path led us past a small creek that babbled pleasantly over moss-covered rocks. We stopped to refill our water bottles and splash our faces with the cool water. The forest felt alive around us, but in a peaceful way. Squirrels chattered in the trees above, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker drummed against dead wood. As we continued climbing, I noticed the trail beginning to narrow slightly. The blue blazes became less frequent, though they were still visible enough to follow confidently. The forest was growing denser too, with thick understory vegetation pressing closer to the path. "The ranger wasn't kidding about this being less maintained," I commented, ducking under a low-hanging branch. "It just adds to the adventure," Trevor replied, pushing aside a tangle of vines that had grown across the trail. "This is what real hiking is supposed to feel like, not those paved paths they call trails at some parks." About 90 minutes in, we came to our first real decision point. The trail split in 2 directions, neither of which was clearly marked on our map. Both paths disappeared into thick forest, and while one appeared slightly wider than the other, the difference was minimal. I pulled out the map and studied it carefully, trying to match our location with the printed route. "I don't see this fork marked anywhere," I said, a note of concern creeping into my voice. Trevor came up beside me and looked over my shoulder at the map. It's probably just a minor split that rejoins further up, he said confidently. These maps aren't always perfectly detailed. I wasn't so sure. The ranger had specifically warned us about the trail system being confusing, and this seemed like exactly the kind of situation he'd been talking about. I looked down both paths, trying to see if one showed more evidence of recent use, but the forest floor was covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves that obscured any footprints. Maybe we should go back and ask the ranger, I suggested. But even as I said it, I knew Trevor wouldn't want to backtrack. He was the type who viewed retracing steps as admitting defeat. Come on, he said, shouldering his pack. I can hear water running from this direction. He pointed to the left fork. That has to be the stream that feeds the waterfall. If we follow it, we'll find what we're looking for. I strained to listen and could indeed hear the faint sound of running water from that direction. It seemed logical enough, and I didn't want to be the one to spoil our adventure with excessive caution. Against my better judgment, I nodded agreement. Okay, but if we don't find a trail marker, or the path doesn't seem right, we're turning back immediately, I said firmly. Deal, Trevor agreed, though I could tell he was already mentally committed to pushing forward regardless. We took the left fork, and almost immediately I could tell this was different from the main trail. The path was narrower and less defined, with vegetation encroaching from both sides. The canopy overhead was thicker too, blocking more sunlight and creating a darker, more enclosed feeling. The sound of running water grew stronger as we walked, which was encouraging, but the trail markers had disappeared completely. I kept looking for blue blazes on the trees, but found none. When I mentioned this to Trevor, he brushed off my concern. We're probably just on a connecting trail, he said. These systems often have multiple routes that aren't all marked the same way. After another 20 minutes of walking, the path had narrowed to barely more than an animal trail. Branches grabbed at our clothes and packs, and I had to push through spider webs that stretched across the path. The cheerful chatter of our earlier hike had faded into focused navigation through increasingly difficult terrain. Trevor, I don't think this is right, I said, stopping to extract a thorn that had caught in my sleeve. This doesn't feel like a maintained trail at all. He paused ahead of me and looked back. For the first time since we'd taken the fork, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his face, but then his jaw set in that stubborn way I'd learned to recognize. The water sound is getting stronger, he said. We must be getting close to something. Let's just push through this rough patch. The next section of our journey became a nightmare of thick vegetation and uncertain footing. What had started as a narrow but passable trail devolved into something that barely deserved the name. We were essentially bushwhacking now, pushing through dense undergrowth that seemed determined to trap us. Thorny vines caught at our clothes with every step. Low branches slapped at our faces, leaving scratches on our arms and hands. The forest floor was uneven and treacherous, full of hidden roots and moss-covered rocks that threatened to send us tumbling. More than once I had to grab onto Trevor's pack to steady myself after my foot found an unexpected depression. The sound of running water continued to tantalize us from somewhere ahead, always seeming just out of reach. But instead of the pleasant babbling we'd heard earlier, this sounded different, more urgent, almost aggressive in its intensity. It echoed strangely off the trees, making it difficult to determine exactly which direction it was coming from. This can't be right, I said for the third time, having to raise my voice to be heard over the sound of rushing water. We've been fighting through brush for 30 minutes. No maintained trail would be like this. Trevor stopped and turned back to me, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air under the canopy. His clothing was torn in several places, and a thin line of blood marked where a branch had scraped across his cheek. I know it's rough, he admitted, but listen to how strong that water sound is now. We have to be almost there. I wanted to argue, wanted to insist we turn back immediately, but the truth was, I wasn't entirely sure we could find our way back even if we tried. The path we'd been following had disappeared entirely, and the thick vegetation we'd pushed through had already begun to spring back into place behind us, obscuring our route. As we pressed forward, the character of the forest began to change in ways that made me increasingly uncomfortable. The trees grew larger and older, their trunks twisted into strange shapes that seemed almost deliberate. Moss hung from the branches like tattered curtains, and the air felt heavier, more oppressive. The wildlife sounds that had been so pleasant earlier were gone now. No birds sang in these deeper woods. No squirrels chattered in the branches. The only sounds were our labored breathing, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and that persistent, ominous rushing of water somewhere ahead. I began to notice other troubling details as we struggled forward. Dead trees stood among the living ones like skeletal fingers reaching toward the canopy. The bark on many of the living trees was scarred and blackened, as if they'd survived some kind of blight or fire. The very air seemed to taste different here, stale and slightly metallic. "Trevor," I said, grabbing his arm to make him stop. "Something's not right about this place. We need to turn back now." He looked around, and I could see in his eyes that he was finally beginning to share my unease. The confident expression he'd worn all day was cracking, replaced by something that might have been worry. "Okay," he said quietly. "Maybe you're right. Let's head back to the main trail." But when we turned to retrace our steps, the problem became immediately apparent. The route we'd taken was no longer visible. The dense undergrowth had closed behind us like water, leaving no clear indication of which direction we'd come from. Every direction looked the same, a maze of trees, vines, and shadows. I felt panic beginning to rise in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. "We just need to think logically," I said, as much to myself as to Trevor. "We've been heading roughly east toward the water sound, so if we go west we should find our way back." The problem was that in the thick forest, with the heavy canopy blocking most of the sky, it was impossible to tell which direction was which. The sun was completely obscured, and every direction looked identical. We picked what we hoped was the right direction, and began to backtrack. But after 10 minutes of fighting through the undergrowth, nothing looked familiar. The landscape seemed to shift around us, as if the forest itself was actively working to confuse us. "Wait," Trevor said suddenly, holding up his hand. "Do you hear that?" I stopped and listened. The sound of rushing water had changed again. Instead of coming from one direction, it now seemed to surround us, echoing off the trees from multiple angles. But there was something else too, a rhythmic sound, like footsteps coming from somewhere behind us. We both froze, straining to listen. The footstep sounds stopped immediately, as if whatever was making them had also stopped to listen. "Probably just another hiker," Trevor said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Hello?" he called out. "Is someone there?" No response came. The forest around us was utterly silent, except for that strange, omnipresent sound of rushing water. We waited for what felt like several minutes, then began moving again. Almost immediately, the footstep sounds resumed, not quite matching our rhythm, but close enough to make it clear that something was following us. My heart began to pound, and I had to fight to keep my breathing steady. "Trevor, we need to get out of here, now." He nodded, his face pale. We abandoned any pretense of following a path and began pushing through the forest as quickly as possible, heading in what we hoped was the direction of the main trail. Behind us, the following footsteps continued, maintaining the same distance but never quite disappearing. The terrain became even more difficult as we fled, with steep slopes and thick patches of thorny undergrowth that tore at our clothes and skin. I was breathing hard now, partly from exertion and partly from fear. Every time I looked back, I expected to see someone following us, but the forest revealed nothing. After what felt like an eternity of desperate flight through the increasingly hostile woods, we emerged suddenly into a small clearing. I was gasping for breath, my clothes torn and my hands scratched from the thorns. Trevor looked equally battered, and when our eyes met, I saw my own fear reflected in his face. "Which way?" I whispered, scanning the edges of the clearing for some indication of the right direction. Before Trevor could answer, I realized something that made my blood freeze. He wasn't there. The clearing was empty except for me. I spun around, searching frantically. "Trevor? Trevor?" I called out, but there was no response. Somehow, impossibly, I had emerged from the thick forest alone. The realization that I was completely alone hit me like a physical blow. I stood in the center of the small clearing, turning in slow circles, calling Trevor's name until my voice grew hoarse. How was it possible? He had been right behind me just moments before, pushing through the same tangle of vegetation. "Trevor," I screamed, no longer caring who or what might hear me. "Where are you?" The forest swallowed my voice without even an echo. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. Not even the sound of rushing water penetrated this space, as if the clearing existed in some bubble separate from the rest of the woods. I forced myself to think rationally. We must have gotten separated in the thick undergrowth without realizing it. Maybe he had gone around a tree while I went the other way. Or perhaps one of us had veered slightly off course. It had been so difficult to see more than a few feet in any direction. I walked back to the edge of the clearing where I thought I had emerged, and began calling again. "Trevor? I'm in a clearing. Can you hear me?" Nothing. I tried to push back into the forest to look for him, but the vegetation was so thick and intertwined that I couldn't tell exactly where I had come from. Every direction looked the same, an impenetrable wall of green punctuated by dark spaces between the trees. Panic was building in my chest now, making it hard to breathe. I had never been lost in the wilderness before, had never experienced the particular terror that comes with being completely alone in an unfamiliar and potentially dangerous place. The safety that comes from being part of a pair, from having someone to share decisions and fears with, was suddenly gone. I pulled out my phone, hoping against hope that I might have enough signal to call for help or at least text someone our location. The screen showed no bars at all, not even emergency service coverage. The device that had been so essential to my daily life was now nothing more than dead weight in my pocket. Looking up at the sky through the canopy, I tried to gauge how much daylight remained. The sun was definitely lower than it had been when we started our hike, but under the thick forest cover it was difficult to judge exactly what time it was. My phone showed 3:47 p.m., which meant we had been hiking for nearly 4 hours. How much of that time had been spent on the wrong trail? I needed to make a decision. I could stay in the clearing and hope that Trevor would find me, or I could try to find my way back to the main trail. Neither option felt safe, but staying put at least meant I wouldn't get more lost than I already was. I decided to wait for 30 minutes to see if Trevor would appear. I found a fallen log near the center of the clearing, and sat down, trying to calm my racing heart and think through our situation logically. We had taken the wrong fork in the trail, at least 2 hours ago. Since then, we had been traveling through increasingly wild forest, getting farther and farther from any marked trails. Even if I could figure out which direction to go, it would take hours to backtrack to the point where we had made our mistake. As I sat there, I began to notice details about the clearing that I had missed in my initial panic. It was almost perfectly circular, maybe 50 feet across, with grass that was unusually short and even. The trees around the perimeter were all roughly the same age and height, as if they had been planted deliberately rather than grown naturally. More disturbing was what I found when I looked more closely at the ground. Scattered among the grass were small bones. Nothing large, but definitely animal bones of some kind. They were old and weathered, some partially buried in the earth. I told myself they were probably just the remains of small animals that had died naturally, but their distribution seemed too deliberate, too organized. The 30 minutes I had decided to wait stretched into an hour. I called Trevor's name every few minutes, but the forest remained stubbornly silent. As the light began to fade, I knew I couldn't stay in the clearing much longer. Whatever had happened to Trevor, I needed to find help while there was still enough daylight to navigate. I chose the direction that seemed most likely to lead back toward the main trail, and began walking. Within minutes I was once again fighting through thick vegetation, branches catching at my pack and roots threatening to trip me with every step. The character of the forest seemed to change the farther I got from the clearing. The trees grew taller and more gnarled, their branches intertwining overhead in ways that blocked most of the remaining daylight. The air grew colder too, and I could smell something unpleasant, a musty, decaying odor that seemed to come from the forest floor itself. I had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when I heard the sound that made every nerve in my body go rigid with fear. Footsteps, deliberate and measured, were coming from somewhere behind me. But these weren't Trevor's footsteps. I knew the rhythm of his walk, and this was different, heavier, more purposeful. I stopped moving and held my breath, listening intently. The footsteps continued for several more seconds, then stopped abruptly. Whoever was following me had realized I had stopped. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Trevor, is that you?" No answer came, but I could feel a presence watching me from the dark spaces between the trees. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to think. If it was another hiker, they would have responded to my call. If it was Trevor, he definitely would have answered. That left possibilities I didn't want to consider. I began walking again, faster now, pushing through the undergrowth with less care for the branches that scratched at my skin. Behind me, the footsteps resumed, maintaining the same distance but matching my increased pace. My mind raced through explanations. Maybe it was a park ranger searching for lost hikers. Maybe it was Trevor, and something had happened to prevent him from responding. Maybe he was hurt or disoriented. But even as I tried to convince myself of these rational explanations, a deeper part of my mind rejected them. The footsteps sounded wrong. Too heavy, too deliberate, and something about their rhythm seemed almost predatory. The pursuit continued for what felt like miles. Every time I stopped, the footsteps behind me stopped. Every time I changed direction, trying to lose whoever was following me, the sounds adjusted accordingly. Whoever it was seemed to know the forest much better than I did, moving through the underbrush with an ease that suggested long familiarity with this terrain. As the last traces of daylight began to fade from the forest, I knew I was in serious trouble. I was completely lost, separated from Trevor with no idea what had happened to him, and being stalked by someone or something through increasingly dark and hostile woods. The temperature was dropping too, and my light summer hiking clothes wouldn't provide much warmth once full darkness fell. That's when I saw him. The figure stood motionless between two large oak trees, maybe 70 feet away from me. At first glance, I thought it might be Trevor, and relief flooded through me so powerfully that I actually took a step forward before my brain processed what my eyes were seeing. This was not Trevor. The man was tall, unusually tall, with a lanky build that looked almost unnaturally elongated in the fading light. He stood perfectly still, and even at that distance I could tell he was staring directly at me. There was something deeply wrong with his posture, too rigid, too controlled, like a predator that had frozen mid-hunt. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking despite my effort to sound confident. "I'm lost. Can you help me find the main trail?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move, didn't give any indication that he had heard me at all. He just continued to stare with an intensity that I could feel even across the distance between us. I squinted through the growing darkness, trying to make out details. His clothes appeared to be dark, maybe black or dark brown, and seemed oddly formal for someone hiking in the woods. His hair was long and unkempt, hanging down past his shoulders in a way that partially obscured his face. But it was his face that made my stomach drop with instinctive terror. Even from that distance, even in the poor light, I could see that something was horribly wrong. The left side of his face appeared to be damaged, scarred or melted or burned. I couldn't tell which, but the skin had an unnatural waxy texture that reflected the fading light in disturbing ways. His left eye was either missing or sealed shut, and where it should have been was just a dark hollow. His right eye, however, was fixed on me with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. Even across the distance, I could see it gleaming with what might have been moisture, or might have been something far worse. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice echoing strangely in the dense forest. "I have pepper spray." It was a lie. I had nothing but a small folding knife in my pack, and I doubted I could reach it quickly if I needed to. At the sound of my voice, the man's head tilted slightly to one side, like a dog hearing an interesting sound. The movement was too quick, too sharp, and it reminded me unnervingly of a bird of prey focusing on potential food. I began backing away slowly, never taking my eyes off the figure. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. Every step backward was a calculated risk. I couldn't see what was behind me, and the forest floor was treacherous with roots and rocks that could send me tumbling. The man began to move. His first step forward was deliberate and measured, and I noticed that he moved with absolute silence. No crunch of leaves, no snapping of twigs. It was as if he weighed nothing at all, or as if he knew exactly where to place each foot to avoid making sound. "Get away from me," I screamed, abandoning any pretense of calm. "Leave me alone." This time he responded. His mouth opened in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth that looked wrong. Too large, too sharp, and stained with something dark. When he spoke, his voice was a horrible rasp that seemed to come from deep in his damaged throat. "Where are you going?" he asked, the words drawn out and slurred by whatever injury had damaged his face. "The woods get dangerous after dark. You should stay with me." Terror flooded my system like ice water. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, and for once I listened. I spun around and crashed through the underbrush, no longer caring about stealth or finding a path. Branches whipped at my face and tore at my clothes, but I kept running. Behind me, I could hear him coming. Despite his size and the thick vegetation, he moved through the forest with disturbing ease, crashing through obstacles that slowed me down without seeming to lose any ground. Worse, he was making sounds now, not quite laughter, but a wet gurgling noise that suggested he was enjoying the chase. I ran with the desperate energy that comes from pure fear, leaping over fallen logs and crashing through tangles of vines that would have stopped me cold under normal circumstances. My lungs burned and my legs felt like they were turning to rubber, but I knew that stopping meant something far worse than exhaustion. The sounds of pursuit grew louder behind me. He was getting closer, and I could hear him calling out as he chased me through the darkening forest. "Don't run," he wheezed, his damaged voice carrying clearly through the trees. "I just want to talk. I get so lonely out here." The reasonableness of his words delivered in that horrible voice were somehow more terrifying than if he had been screaming threats. There was something calculated about his tone, something that suggested a mind that was not just dangerous but deeply twisted. I burst through a particularly thick patch of undergrowth and found myself on what looked like another trail. Not the main one, but at least a clear path through the forest. I could run faster here, but I realized with growing horror that the sounds behind me had become more organized. He wasn't just crashing through the brush anymore. He was following the same trail, and his pace was picking up. The trail curved sharply to the left, and as I rounded the bend, I saw something that made me stumble in surprise. A second figure stood in the path ahead of me, blocking my route. For a split second, I thought it might be Trevor, but as I got closer, I realized this was someone else entirely. Shorter than my pursuer, but equally disturbing in his own way. This man was older, with gray hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in years. He stood with his arms crossed, smiling at me with an expression that was meant to look friendly but failed completely. I was trapped. Behind me, I could hear the first man getting closer, his raspy breathing clearly audible now. Ahead of me, the second figure blocked the trail. On either side, the forest was too thick to push through quickly. "Well, well," said the man ahead of me, his voice oily and unpleasant. "What do we have here? A little lost hiker?" The two men had me trapped between them on the narrow trail, and the reality of my situation hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a chance encounter with fellow hikers or even a single dangerous individual. These two were working together, and I was their target. "Please," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just want to get back to the main trail. I'm not looking for any trouble." The older man ahead of me laughed, a sound like grinding gravel. "Oh, you're not looking for trouble? Well, that's too bad, because trouble seems to have found you anyway." Behind me, I could hear the tall man with the damaged face getting closer. His raspy breathing was audible now, along with that wet sound he made that might have been laughter. I was maybe 30 seconds away from being caught between them. I looked desperately at the forest on either side of the trail. The undergrowth was thick, but maybe if I could push through fast enough, I could get away before they could follow. It was a risk, but staying on the trail meant certain capture. "I have friends coming," I lied desperately. "They're right behind me. If you hurt me, they'll call the police." The older man's smile widened, revealing teeth that were stained and broken. "Friends? You mean that boyfriend of yours? I wouldn't count on him showing up anytime soon." My blood turned to ice. The implication was clear. They knew about Trevor. Had they done something to him? Was he hurt? Or worse? "What did you do to him?" I demanded, anger momentarily overcoming my fear. "Nothing permanent," the man said, his tone casual and conversational. "Yet. But that depends entirely on how cooperative you decide to be." Behind me, the footsteps had stopped. The tall man was close now, close enough that I could smell him. A nauseating combination of unwashed body and something else, something rotting and sweet that made my stomach turn. I made my decision. Without warning, I threw myself off the trail to the right, crashing through a wall of thorny bushes that tore at my skin and clothes. I heard both men shout behind me, their casual confidence replaced by anger and frustration. The forest floor on this side of the trail sloped steeply downward. and I half ran, half fell down the incline, bouncing off trees and stumbling over hidden obstacles. Branches whipped at my face and thorns caught at my clothing, but I kept moving. I could hear them crashing through the undergrowth behind me, no longer bothering to move quietly. "You're just making this harder on yourself," the older man yelled. "We're going to catch you anyway." I didn't waste breath responding. The slope was getting steeper, and I was moving more by controlled falling than actual running. My ankle twisted painfully on a hidden root, but adrenaline kept me moving despite the shooting pain. The sounds of pursuit were getting closer. Despite their initial surprise, both men seemed to know this forest well, and were navigating the difficult terrain with disturbing ease. I could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their approach like experienced hunters. The steep slope ended abruptly at a rocky outcrop, and I had to grab onto a tree trunk to keep from tumbling over what appeared to be a 15-foot drop. Below me was a narrow ravine with a small creek running through it. The water was moving fast and looked deep enough to be dangerous, but staying up here meant facing my pursuers. I could hear them getting closer, maybe 30 seconds behind me now. The choice was between the unknown danger of the ravine and the certain threat of the two men who had been hunting me through the darkening forest. I chose the ravine. The drop was farther than it had looked from above, and I hit the rocky ground hard enough to knock the wind out of my lungs. Pain shot through my left shoulder and my already twisted ankle, but nothing seemed to be broken. I scrambled to my feet and looked up at the outcrop I had just fallen from. Both men were there, looking down at me. In the fading light, their faces looked like something from a nightmare. The tall one with his melted features and hollow eye socket. The older one with his predatory smile and stained teeth. "Nowhere to run now," the older man called down. "That ravine only goes one direction, and we know where it comes out." The tall man with the damaged face was already moving, looking for a way down. He found it quickly, a series of natural handholds in the rock face that would allow him to climb down easily. I turned and ran along the bottom of the ravine, following the creek as it wound through the rocky channel. The water was loud here, drowning out other sounds, which meant I couldn't tell how close my pursuers were. The ravine walls were too steep and smooth to climb, so my only option was to keep moving forward and hope I could find another way out before they caught up. The creek bed was treacherous, full of loose rocks and hidden holes that threatened to send me tumbling into the rushing water. More than once I had to grab onto the rocky wall to keep my balance. My ankle was definitely sprained now, sending sharp pains up my leg with every step. Behind me, I could hear shouting, though the words were lost in the sound of rushing water. They had made it down into the ravine and were following me. The older man had been right. There was nowhere else to go but forward. The ravine curved sharply to the left, and as I rounded the bend, I saw something that made my heart sink. Ahead of me, the creek disappeared into what looked like a low tunnel carved through the rock. The opening was maybe 4 feet high and completely dark. I would have to crawl through on my hands and knees, and I had no idea how long it was or where it led. But behind me, the sounds of pursuit were getting closer. I could hear them clearly now despite the sound of the water. Both men calling out to each other, their voices echoing off the ravine walls. I dropped to my knees and crawled into the tunnel. The tunnel was even smaller than it had appeared from outside, forcing me to crawl on my belly through cold, rushing water that soaked through my clothes immediately. The rocky ceiling pressed down just inches above my head, and more than once I scraped my back on protruding stones. The darkness was absolute minors. I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. The sound of water was deafening in the confined space, echoing off the stone walls in a way that disoriented me completely. I had no idea how long the tunnel was, or whether it even had an exit. For all I knew, I was crawling toward a dead end where I would be trapped like an animal in a burrow. Behind me, I could hear muffled shouting. My pursuers had reached the tunnel entrance, and I could only imagine their frustration at finding me gone. The older man's voice carried clearly even over the sound of rushing water. "She went into the tunnel. The crazy bitch actually went in there. Can we follow her?" That was the tall man with the damaged face, his raspy voice barely audible. "Not both of us. You're too big. But I know where this comes out. We can catch her on the other side." The implication made my blood freeze. They knew this area well enough to anticipate where I would emerge. Even if I made it through the tunnel alive, they would be waiting for me. I forced myself to keep crawling forward through the icy water. My hands were numb now, and I could barely feel the rocks under my palms. The current was stronger than I had expected, and more than once it threatened to sweep my legs out from under me and send me tumbling downstream in the darkness. The tunnel seemed to go on forever. My lungs were burning from the effort of dragging myself forward while fighting against the current, and my clothes were completely soaked, making every movement more difficult. Worst of all, I was starting to worry about hypothermia. The water was shockingly cold, and I could already feel my core body temperature dropping. Just when I thought I couldn't crawl another foot, I saw a faint glow ahead of me. The tunnel was finally coming to an end, opening into what looked like another section of the ravine. I dragged myself forward with renewed energy, focused entirely on reaching that blessed light. I emerged from the tunnel like a half-drowned rat, gasping and shivering uncontrollably. The ravine here was wider than where I had entered the tunnel, with steep but climbable walls on both sides. The creek continued on through another narrow channel, but there were several large boulders that I could use to get out of the water. I hauled myself onto the nearest boulder and took stock of my situation. My clothes were soaked through, and I was shivering so violently that I could barely keep my teeth from chattering. My ankle throbbed with each heartbeat, and my shoulder ached from the fall earlier. But I was alive, and for the moment, I was free of my pursuers. That illusion of safety lasted exactly 30 seconds. Well, look what crawled out of the tunnel. The voice came from above me, and my heart sank as I looked up to see the older man standing on the rim of the ravine, looking down at me with that same predatory smile. He had found another route around the tunnel and was already in position to cut off my escape. "I told you we knew where this came out," he said, conversationally. "You made good time, though. I'm impressed." I looked around desperately for another escape route. The ravine walls were steep but not impossible to climb, if I could reach them without being caught. The creek continued on through another narrow channel, but I couldn't face the prospect of crawling through another tunnel, especially in my current condition. "Where's my boyfriend?" I called up, trying to buy time while I evaluated my options. "What did you do to Trevor?" The man's smile widened. "He's safe. For now. Whether he stays that way depends entirely on you."
"What do you want?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer.
"What we want," he said, "is for you to stop running and come with us quietly. You're only making this harder on yourself and on him." The implication was clear. They had Trevor, and they were using him as leverage against me. But I couldn't bring myself to believe that surrendering would actually keep either of us safe. These men had been hunting me through the forest like an animal. Whatever they wanted, it wasn't going to end well for either Trevor or me. I made my decision. Without warning, I threw myself off the boulder and ran toward the far wall of the ravine. It was maybe 20 feet of open ground, but if I could reach the rocky wall, I might be able to climb up and out before he could stop me. I almost made it. I had my hands on the rock face and was pulling myself up when something slammed into my back, sending me crashing to the ground. The tall man with the melted face had somehow made it through the tunnel after all, or found another way around. His weight pinned me to the rocky ground, and I could feel his hot breath on my neck. "Got her," he rasped, his damaged voice right next to my ear. "She's feistier than most, but we got her." I struggled desperately, trying to throw him off, but he was much larger and stronger than me. His hands grabbed my wrists and twisted them behind my back with practiced ease. This wasn't the first time he had done this. "Let me go," I screamed, putting every ounce of strength I had left into fighting against his grip. "Help! Somebody help me!" The older man had climbed down into the ravine now, and was walking toward us casually, as if this was all perfectly normal. "Nobody can hear you out here," he said matter-of-factly. "We're miles from any trails, miles from any roads. You picked a very remote place to get lost." Terror flooded through me as the full reality of my situation became clear. I was completely at the mercy of two dangerous men in one of the most isolated places I had ever been. No one knew where I was. No one was coming to help. The tall man was trying to tie my hands behind my back with what felt like rope. I thrashed and fought, making it as difficult as possible, but his grip was like iron. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through my injured shoulder and ankle. "Stop fighting," he wheezed in my ear. "You're just making this take longer." "Go to hell," I snarled back. earning myself a sharp cuff to the side of my head that made stars explode across my vision. That's when I heard it, a sound that might have been my imagination, or might have been the most beautiful thing I had ever heard in my life. Car engines, distant but unmistakable, coming from somewhere above the ravine. The older man heard it too, and his casual confidence wavered for the first time. What the hell? There's no road up there. But there was something up there. Something with multiple engines that was getting closer. And then I heard voices. People calling out. Though I couldn't make out the words. The tall man's grip on me loosened slightly, as both of them turned their attention to the sounds from above. It was the chance I had been waiting for. I twisted violently in his grasp, managed to get one hand free, and raked my fingernails across his damaged face as hard as I could. He screamed and jerked backward, blood flowing from fresh scratches across his scarred cheek. I scrambled away from him and ran toward the sound of the voices, screaming as loudly as I could. "Help me! I'm down here! Help!" The response was immediate and overwhelming. Multiple voices began shouting from above, and powerful flashlight beams cut through the gathering darkness, sweeping back and forth across the ravine until they found me. "There she is, down in the creek bed. We've got her. She's alive. Ma'am, are you injured? Can you move?" I looked up through tears of relief to see at least 6 people on the rim of the ravine, all wearing the uniforms of park rangers and emergency responders. Behind them, I could see the flashing lights of multiple vehicles. The sounds I had heard were search and rescue teams. "There are 2 men," I screamed up at them. "They were chasing me. They have my boyfriend." But when I turned to point out my attackers, the ravine behind me was empty. Both men had vanished as quickly and silently as they had appeared, melting back into the forest like shadows. The rescue took over an hour. Getting me out of the ravine safely required ropes and a rescue harness, and my injuries made the process slow and difficult. But the paramedics were gentle and professional, treating my sprained ankle and various cuts and scrapes while asking careful questions about what had happened. "We got a call about 2 missing hikers," explained Ranger Mills, the same man who had given us the trail map that morning. "Your boyfriend made it back to the parking area around sunset. He was pretty banged up and completely panicked. Said you 2 had gotten separated and he couldn't find you." The relief I felt at learning Trevor was safe was so overwhelming that I started crying again. All through my ordeal, I had been terrified that those men had done something terrible to him. "He's fine," the ranger assured me. "Cuts and bruises, but nothing serious. He's waiting for you at the command post." As they lifted me out of the ravine, I tried to explain about the 2 men who had been chasing me. The rangers listened carefully and took detailed notes, but I could see skepticism in their eyes. In the harsh light of the emergency response, my story sounded almost unbelievable, even to me. "We'll definitely investigate," Ranger Mills assured me. "But you have to understand, people get disoriented when they're lost and scared. Sometimes the mind can play tricks, especially in low light conditions." I wanted to argue, wanted to insist that what I had experienced was completely real. But I was exhausted and in pain, and part of me was starting to wonder if he might be right. Had my terror-filled flight through the darkening forest caused me to imagine threats that weren't really there? The reunion with Trevor was emotional and overwhelming. He was waiting at the search command post, which had been set up in the parking lot. And the moment he saw me being helped out of the rescue vehicle, he ran over and wrapped me in a careful hug. "God, I'm so sorry," he said over and over again. "I should never have pushed us to take that wrong trail. I should have listened when you said we should turn back." "It's not your fault," I told him, though part of me was still angry about his stubborn insistence on continuing when I had wanted to retreat. "How did we get separated?" His story was similar to mine. He had been pushing through thick undergrowth, assuming I was right behind him, when he suddenly emerged into a different clearing and realized I was gone. He had searched frantically for over an hour before finally admitting defeat and trying to find his way back to the main trail. "I kept hearing someone moving around in the woods," he said. "I thought it was you at first, but when I called out, there was never any answer. It was like someone was following me, staying just out of sight." That detail sent a chill down my spine. Maybe I hadn't imagined the 2 men after all. Maybe they had been watching both of us, waiting for us to separate before making their move. The police investigation that followed was thorough but ultimately inconclusive. Officers searched the areas where I reported encountering the two men, but found no physical evidence of their presence. No footprints, no camping equipment, no indication that anyone had been living rough in those remote sections of the forest. It's possible they were transients, the detective explained to me a few days later. People sometimes camp illegally in state forests, especially if they're trying to avoid law enforcement for other reasons. If that's the case, they would know how to move through the woods without leaving traces. But even the detective seemed skeptical about some aspects of my story. The tunnel I described couldn't be located. Despite extensive searches of the ravine system, the creek I remembered following didn't match any of the waterways on the official park maps. Trauma and fear can affect memory and perception, the detective said gently. It's possible that some details got confused or exaggerated in your mind. The important thing is that you're safe now. I wanted to believe that explanation. It would have been easier to accept that my terrifying ordeal had been partly imaginary than to live with the knowledge that two dangerous men were still out there somewhere in the forest. But I couldn't forget certain details. The smell of the tall man when he pinned me to the ground, the specific sound of the older man's voice when he threatened Trevor, the feeling of rough rope against my wrists. These sensations were too vivid, too real to dismiss as products of a panicked imagination. Trevor and I stayed together for another few months after the incident, but the experience had changed something fundamental between us. He blamed himself for insisting we take the wrong trail, while I struggled with anger about his refusal to listen to my concerns. More than that, though, the ordeal had left me with a persistent anxiety about being in remote places that made our outdoor adventures no longer enjoyable. We finally broke up that fall, not because of any dramatic fight, but simply because we had grown into different people after our shared trauma. He moved to another city for a job opportunity, and we gradually lost touch. I still hike occasionally, but never alone, and never on unmarked or poorly maintained trails. I stick to popular parks with good cell coverage and clear signage every few hundred yards. My friends think I'm being overly cautious, but they weren't there that day in the forest. They didn't experience the particular terror that comes from being hunted by something predatory and wrong. Sometimes, when I'm on a trail and the forest grows particularly quiet, I find myself looking over my shoulder and listening for the sound of footsteps that don't quite match my own rhythm. Most of the time there's nothing there but my own imagination, heightened by memory and residual fear. But sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision that vanishes when I turn to look directly. Sometimes I hear branches breaking in the distance with no visible cause, and sometimes late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I can still smell that nauseating combination of unwashed body and sweet decay that clung to the tall man with the melted face. The official report classified the incident as a case of hikers becoming lost and disoriented, with possible minor hallucinations caused by stress and dehydration. Trevor and I were commended for our quick thinking in getting back to safety, and new warning signs were posted at several trailheads about staying on marked paths. But I know what I experienced that day. I know that somewhere in the deep woods of Crows Ridge State Park, there are two men who hunt lost hikers for reasons I don't want to imagine. I know that whatever happened to Trevor and me was not the first time they had done this, and I doubt it was the last. The forest holds its secrets, and some of them are more terrible than we want to admit. Every time I read about missing hikers or unexplained disappearances in remote areas, I wonder if someone else has encountered the same predatory presence that stalked me through those dark woods. I survived that day, but something in me was forever changed by the experience. The world felt a little less safe, a little more unpredictable, and I learned that sometimes the monsters we fear in the dark are very real indeed. They walk on two legs. They know how to use the forest to their advantage, and they are always watching for the next opportunity to hunt. That knowledge is a burden I carry with me every day, along with the memory of a tall man with a melted face who moves through the woods without making a sound, and an older man with stained teeth who knows exactly where every trail leads and how to cut off every possible escape route. They're still out there, somewhere in the endless green maze of trees and shadows, waiting for the next lost hiker to stumble into their domain. And sometimes, in the depths of sleepless nights, I wonder if they remember me as clearly as I remember them, and if they're still looking for the one who got away. The gymnasium had been transformed into something that vaguely resembled elegance, if you squinted hard enough and ignored the basketball hoops draped in cheap fabric. Streamers hung from the ceiling like the entrails of some pastel beast, and the disco ball cast fractured light across the faces of my classmates as they swayed to music that seemed to echo from another world entirely. I wasn't part of that world, not tonight, not ever. Being a sophomore at prom was like being a ghost at a funeral. You were there, but nobody really wanted to acknowledge your presence. The seniors moved through the space like they owned it, which I suppose they did, their rented tuxedos and borrowed dresses creating a barrier between us underclassmen and the sacred ritual of their final dance. I had volunteered to help with cleanup, partly because I needed the community service hours, but mostly because I had nothing better to do on a Saturday night. The venue was actually pretty impressive. The old train station had been converted into an event space, and the high ceilings and exposed brick walls gave it character that our school gym could never match. But as the night wore on and the last couples filtered out into the parking lot, their laughter echoing off the empty platform outside, the place began to feel less magical and more like a tomb. The decorations that had seemed festive hours earlier now hung like funeral shrouds in the dim lighting. I spent the better part of 2 hours taking down streamers, folding chairs, and sweeping up the debris of teenage dreams. The other volunteers, mostly freshmen like me who had been roped into service, worked in tired silence, our footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The teachers supervising us looked just as eager to get home, checking their watches and making increasingly obvious hints about wrapping things up. By the time we finished, it was well past midnight. The parking lot had emptied except for a few stragglers and the cleanup crew. My 1994 F-150 sat alone under a flickering streetlight, looking as out of place among the few remaining cars as I had felt among the prom-goers. The truck was a beast, built like a tank, my dad always said. But it was also a piece of shit that guzzled gas and made noises that would wake the dead. Still, it was mine, and in rural South Virginia, having any wheels was better than having no wheels at all. I climbed into the driver's seat, and the familiar smell of worn leather and motor oil wrapped around me like a security blanket. The engine turned over with a reluctant growl, and I sat there for a moment, letting it warm up while I figured out my route home. The GPS on my phone was useless out here. Too many dead zones and country roads that hadn't been updated since the Civil War. I'd have to rely on my memory and the vague directions one of the teachers had given me about getting back to the main highway. The radio crackled to life, picking up some distant station playing country music that seemed to drift in and out of static. I turned it off, preferring the silence to the ghostly voices that seemed to be calling from somewhere beyond the reach of the airwaves. The parking lot was empty now except for my truck, and the train station loomed behind me like a monument to forgotten journeys. I pulled out of the lot and onto the rural road, my headlights cutting through the darkness like twin knives. The night air was thick with the smell of recent rain and growing things. The kind of earthy organic scent that city people romanticize but that country folks know can hide all manner of death and decay. The road stretched ahead of me, a ribbon of cracked asphalt that seemed to disappear into the mouth of some great beast. This part of Virginia was old. Older than the towns, older than the roads, older than the people who thought they owned it. The land had a memory, and sometimes on nights like this you could feel it pressing against the windows of your car, whispering secrets that your rational mind refused to accept. I'd grown up here, but I'd never gotten used to the way the darkness seemed to have weight out here, the way it pressed down on you like the palm of some massive hand. The cornfields began about a mile from the train station, stretching out on both sides of the road like a green sea frozen in time. During the day they were beautiful in their own way, orderly rows of stalks that swayed in the breeze like dancers. But at night they became something else entirely. The corn was tall this time of year, nearly 10 feet in some places, and it created walls of shadow that seemed to shift and move in the corner of your vision. The headlights could only penetrate so far into those verdant depths, and beyond their reach lay a darkness that felt alive and hungry. I was doing about 45, maybe 50 miles per hour. Fast enough to get home at a reasonable hour, but not so fast that I couldn't handle the curves and hills that dotted this particular stretch of road. My newly minted driver's license was still crisp in my wallet, and I was hyper-aware of every movement of the steering wheel, every pressure on the gas pedal. The freedom of driving was intoxicating, but it came with a responsibility that sometimes felt crushing. The night pressed against the windows like a living thing, and I found myself checking the rearview mirror more often than necessary. There was nothing back there except the road I'd already traveled. But something about the darkness felt different tonight. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was the presence of something else. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up even though I couldn't name what it was. The sensation hit me like a physical blow, a bone-jarring impact that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. The left side of my truck lurched skyward with a violence that defied physics, as if some giant hand had reached up from the depths and tried to flip the vehicle. For a heart-stopping moment, I was airborne, my stomach dropping into my boots as the F-150's massive frame twisted and bucked like a living thing. The steering wheel fought against my grip, trying to tear itself from my hands with a fury that seemed almost personal. My seatbelt cut into my chest as I was thrown against the driver's side door, then slammed back against the seat with enough force to drive the air from my lungs. The world outside the windows became a blur of spinning darkness and fractured light as the truck's headlights swept across the cornfield in wild, erratic arcs. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. What probably lasted only seconds felt like hours. Each moment crystallized in perfect, terrifying clarity. I could hear the screech of metal against asphalt, the grinding of the truck's undercarriage as it scraped against the road surface, the explosive pop of what sounded like a tire blowing out. But underneath it all was another sound, a wet, organic impact that seemed to reverberate through the truck's frame and into my bones. When the truck finally settled back onto all four wheels, the silence that followed was deafening. The engine had stalled, and the only sounds were the tick of cooling metal and the frantic beating of my own heart. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel, and I realized I was hyperventilating, sucking in great gasps of air that tasted of fear and adrenaline. "Holy shit," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the suffocating quiet. "Holy fucking shit." I sat there for a long moment, trying to process what had just happened. Speed bumps didn't feel like that. I'd hit plenty of them in my short driving career, and they were nothing compared to the violence of whatever I'd just run over. This had felt like hitting a boulder, or maybe a tree that had fallen across the road. But I'd been watching the road, hadn't I? I'd been careful, alert, hyper-aware of every shadow and curve. My hands fumbled for the key, and it took 3 tries to get the engine started again. The F-150 grumbled to life with a sound that seemed different somehow. Rougher, more labored, as if the impact had damaged something fundamental in its mechanical heart. The headlights flickered back to life, casting their pale glow across the road ahead. That's when I saw the depression in the asphalt. It was subtle at first, just a slight irregularity in the road surface that caught the light at an odd angle. But as I stared at it, the true extent of the damage became clear. There was a crater in the road, maybe 3 feet wide and several inches deep, with spiderweb cracks radiating outward from the center like the impact site of a meteorite. The asphalt was torn and buckled, chunks of it scattered across the lane like broken teeth. Whatever I'd hit, it had been heavy. Incredibly heavy. Heavy enough to crack the road surface and send my 2-ton truck flying. But what could be that heavy, and still be lying in the middle of a country road? A fallen tree, maybe. But there were no trees close enough to the road to account for such a massive piece of debris. I put the truck in park and reached for the door handle, my legs feeling like jelly as I prepared to get out and assess the damage. The night air hit me like a physical presence, thick and humid and filled with the scent of growing things and something else, something organic and unpleasant that made my stomach turn. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant whisper of wind through the corn stalks and the slow tick of the truck's cooling engine. I took a step toward the crater, my feet crunching on fragments of broken asphalt. The damage was even worse up close. The road surface was completely destroyed, as if something incredibly heavy had been dropped from a great height, or as if something had been lying there with enough mass to create its own gravitational field. But that was impossible. There was nothing on the road now except the debris from the impact. Whatever I'd hit was gone, vanished into the night as if it had never existed. The logical part of my brain tried to offer explanations. Maybe it had been a deer, and the impact had sent it flying into the cornfield. Maybe it had been a piece of farm equipment that had fallen off a truck and then been dragged away by the farmer who'd lost it. But even as I thought these things, I knew they were wrong. The depression in the road was too big, too deep, too perfectly formed to have been caused by anything that simple. And there was something else, something that made the hair on my arms stand up and my skin crawl with primitive fear. I turned back toward the truck. intending to get the hell out of there and deal with the damage assessment once I was safely home. But as I reached for the door handle, I felt it, a presence, heavy and oppressive, pressing against my consciousness like a physical weight. It was the feeling you get when you know you're being watched, when every instinct in your body is screaming that you're no longer alone. Slowly, reluctantly, I turned around. The road behind me was empty. The cornfield stood silent and still, its tall stalks creating an impenetrable wall of shadow on both sides of the asphalt. But there was something wrong with the silence. Something that made it feel less like peace and more like the held breath of a predator preparing to strike. That's when I saw it, a dark shape lying in the middle of the road, perhaps 50 yards back from where I'd stopped. It was massive, easily the size of a large dog or small deer, but there was something wrong with its proportions, something that made my brain refuse to process what it was seeing. The shape was too long, too angular, too wrong to be any animal I'd ever seen. My first instinct was relief. I'd hit someone's dog, and while that was terrible, at least it explained the impact. Dogs were heavy, especially large breeds, and if I'd hit one at 45 miles per hour, it would certainly have been violent enough to damage both the animal and the road surface. My heart sank as I realized I'd have to go back and check on it, to see if it was still alive and needed help. But even as I started walking back toward the shape, something inside me was screaming that this was a mistake. Every primitive instinct I possessed was telling me to get back in the truck and drive away as fast as possible. The darkness seemed to press against me from all sides, and the silence had taken on a quality that felt almost malevolent. The shape didn't move as I approached. It lay perfectly still in the middle of the road, and I found myself hoping against hope that it was dead, not because I wanted to have killed something, but because the alternative was somehow worse. There was something about the way it was positioned, something about the unnatural angles of its limbs that made me want to turn and run. I was maybe 20 feet away when I realized that the shape was breathing. The rise and fall of the thing's ribcage was barely perceptible in the dim red glow of my brake lights, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The breathing was wrong, too slow, too deep, too deliberate. It was the breathing of something that was choosing to breathe, not the automatic reflex of a wounded animal fighting for life. I froze in the middle of the road, my feet suddenly feeling like they were made of lead. The rational part of my brain was still trying to process what I was seeing, offering explanations that became more desperate and less believable with each passing second. It was a dog. It was a deer. It was a person in dark clothing. It was anything except what my eyes were telling me it was. The thing was massive, easily 6 feet long from what I could see, and built like nothing that should exist in the natural world. Its rib cage was visible through what looked like skin stretched too tight over bone, each rib standing out in stark relief like the framework of some abandoned building. The limbs were wrong, too long, too thin, jointed in places where no animal should have joints. And the head was the worst part. It was elongated, almost equine in shape, but there was something fundamentally wrong with the proportions. The skull was too large, too angular, with what looked like deep hollows where the eyes should be. Even in the poor light, I could see that those hollows were filled with a darkness that seemed to absorb the faint red glow of my brake lights. I stood there for what felt like hours, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure it would burst. The thing continued its slow, deliberate breathing, and I found myself synchronizing my own breath to its rhythm without realizing it. The night around us had become absolutely silent. No insects, no wind, no distant traffic. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, without warning, the thing began to move. It didn't get up. Not at first. Instead, it shifted position with a fluid grace that defied its apparent size and weight. The movement was wrong in every possible way, like watching a film played in reverse or a puppet controlled by someone who had never seen how living things actually moved. The limbs folded and unfolded in ways that made my stomach turn, and I heard sounds, wet organic sounds that seemed to come from deep within its body. I wanted to run. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to turn around and sprint back to the truck, to gun the engine and get the hell out of there. But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the asphalt as if they'd grown there, and my eyes were locked onto the thing in the road as if held by some invisible force. The breathing stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than any sound could have been. It was the silence of a predator that had just noticed its prey, the held breath of something preparing to strike. My skin crawled with the sensation of being watched, evaluated, measured. I could feel its attention on me like a physical weight, pressing against my consciousness with an intensity that made my vision blur at the edges. Then, slowly, so slowly that at first I thought I was imagining it, the thing began to rise. It didn't get up like an animal would. There was no struggling, no awkward repositioning of limbs, no gradual transition from prone to standing. Instead, it simply unfolded itself, as if it were made of shadows and darkness rather than flesh and bone. The movement was impossibly smooth, like watching smoke take shape, and it defied every law of physics I thought I understood. As it rose, I realized just how wrong I'd been about its size. What I'd taken for a large dog was actually something much, much bigger. The thing stood at least 7 feet tall, and that was while it was hunched over, its spine curved in a way that suggested it could be much taller if it chose to straighten up. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, like the branches of a dead tree, and they moved with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and utterly horrifying. But it was the face that nearly broke my mind. In the dim red light of my brake lights, I could see features that belonged to no earthly creature. The skull was elongated and narrow, with deep-set sockets that held not eyes but pools of absolute darkness. The jaw was too long, too narrow, filled with what looked like rows of needle-sharp teeth that caught the light like broken glass. And the skin, if it could be called skin, was stretched tight over the bone structure, giving it the appearance of something that had been mummified and then brought back to a horrible semblance of life. The thing turned its head toward me with movements that were too fluid, too precise, too deliberate. I felt its attention settle on me like a physical presence, and suddenly I understood with perfect clarity that I was looking at something that should not exist, something that belonged to a world of nightmares and fever dreams. We stared at each other across the 50 feet of broken asphalt, predator and prey frozen in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. I could feel its intelligence, cold and alien and utterly without mercy. This wasn't some mindless beast. It was something that thought, that planned, that understood exactly what it was looking at when it looked at me. Then, without breaking eye contact, it began to move. The thing didn't walk. It glided across the road surface with movements that seemed to ignore the laws of physics. Its feet barely touched the ground, and when they did, they made no sound at all. It moved like something that existed partially in this world and partially in another, a creature of shadow and nightmare that had somehow found its way into reality. I watched in horror as it approached the edge of the road, where the asphalt met the wall of corn stalks. For a moment, I thought it was going to disappear into the field, to vanish back into whatever hell had spawned it. But instead, it paused at the edge of the cornfield, and turned back to look at me one final time. The message was clear, though no words were spoken. This was its domain, its hunting ground, and I was nothing more than an intruder who had been allowed to live through some cosmic mercy that I couldn't hope to understand. The thing's hollow gaze held mine for several seconds longer, and I felt something cold and alien brush against my mind, a presence that was so fundamentally wrong that it made my sanity recoil like a snail touched by salt. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the thing melted back into the cornfield. One moment it was there, a nightmare made manifest in the red glow of my brake lights, and the next it was gone, leaving behind only the whisper of corn stalks moving in a wind that I couldn't feel. I stood in the middle of the road for a long time after it disappeared, my mind struggling to process what I just witnessed. The rational part of my brain was already working overtime, trying to explain away what I'd seen, to find some logical explanation for the impossible. But deep down, in the primitive part of my consciousness that still remembered when humans were prey animals, I knew exactly what I'd encountered. Something that should not exist had allowed me to live, and I had no idea why. My body moved before my mind had fully processed what had happened. One moment I was standing frozen in the middle of the road, staring at the place where the thing had vanished into the cornfield, and the next I was sprinting toward my truck with a speed I didn't know I possessed. My sneakers slapped against the broken asphalt, and I could hear my own breathing, harsh and ragged in the oppressive silence of the night. The truck door felt like salvation as I yanked it open and threw myself inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, and when I finally managed to start the engine, it sputtered and coughed like it was as eager to get away from this place as I was. The headlights swept across the road ahead, illuminating nothing but empty asphalt and the towering walls of corn on either side. I gunned the engine and felt the F-150 leap forward with a violence that pressed me back into the seat. The speedometer climbed past 50, then 60, then 70 miles per hour, far too fast for this winding country road, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was lurking in that cornfield. The truck was making noises it had never made before, a grinding sound from somewhere in the undercarriage, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from the left front wheel, and an occasional screech of metal on metal that made my teeth ache. But it was moving, carrying me away from the nightmare behind me, and that was all that mattered. The cornfield seemed to stretch on forever, an endless wall of green that pressed against the road from both sides. In the harsh glare of my headlights, the stalks looked like prison bars, and I found myself wondering what else might be hiding in their depths. How many other things like the one I'd encountered were out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting driver to come along. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but the road behind me. But what I saw made my blood turn to ice. There was something moving in the corn, a disturbance in the stalks that was keeping pace with my truck despite the fact that I was doing nearly 80 miles per hour. It was like watching a shark fin cutting through water, except the water was a sea of green corn and the shark was something that had no business existing in the natural world. Come on, I muttered, pressing harder on the accelerator. The engine responded with a roar that seemed to shake the entire truck, and the speedometer needle climbed past 85. The steering wheel vibrated in my hands, and I could feel the vehicle becoming unstable at this speed, but I didn't dare slow down. Whatever was in the cornfield was still there, still pacing me, still watching. The trees finally began to close in around the road, the cornfield giving way to the deep woods that characterized this part of Virginia. The canopy overhead blocked out most of the stars, creating a tunnel of darkness that my headlights barely penetrated. But at least the corn was behind me now, and when I checked the rearview mirror, I could see nothing but empty road stretching back into the night. I forced myself to slow down to a more reasonable speed, though my heart was still hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. The truck's engine was laboring, and I could smell something burning. Oil maybe, or transmission fluid. The impact with whatever that thing had been had damaged more than just the road surface. It had hurt my truck in ways I was only beginning to understand. The forest pressed in on both sides of the road now, and while it was certainly dark and foreboding, it felt infinitely safer than the cornfield. Trees were normal. Trees were natural. Trees didn't hide impossibly tall creatures that moved like living shadows and stared at you with hollow eyes that seemed to see into your soul. I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that the adrenaline and shock of the accident had caused me to hallucinate. Maybe I'd hit a deer after all, and the trauma of the impact had made me see things that weren't there. Maybe the shape in the road had been nothing more than the deer's carcass, and my terrified mind had transformed it into something supernatural. But even as I thought these things, I knew they were lies. The memory of the thing's hollow gaze was burned into my consciousness with a clarity that no hallucination could match. I could still feel the cold, alien presence that had brushed against my mind, still hear the wet, organic sounds it had made as it moved. Whatever I'd encountered back there, it had been real, and it had been watching me with an intelligence that was both ancient and utterly inhuman. The road began to look familiar as I approached the outskirts of town. Streetlights appeared like beacons in the darkness, and I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders as I saw the first signs of civilization: a gas station, a fast food restaurant, a strip mall that looked like paradise after the horror of the cornfield. These were normal things, human things, and they reminded me that I was still in a world that made sense, even if I'd just encountered something that didn't. My house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, and I'd never been so grateful to see anything in my life. The familiar shape of the two-story colonial, with its white siding and blue shutters, looked like a fortress against the darkness. I sat in the truck for a moment, engine running, just staring at the house and trying to process what had happened. The front door was only 30 feet away, but it might as well have been 30 miles. The darkness between the truck and the house seemed thick and alive, filled with potential threats that my newly awakened paranoia insisted were lurking just beyond the reach of the streetlights. What if the thing had followed me home? What if it was waiting for me to get out of the truck, to make myself vulnerable? I forced myself to turn off the engine and open the door. The night air hit me like a physical presence, and I could smell the same organic, earthy scent that had been present at the cornfield. My legs felt like jelly as I stumbled toward the house. my keys jingling in my shaking hands as I fumbled with the lock. The house was silent when I stepped inside, filled with the comfortable darkness of a place where people were sleeping peacefully. My parents' bedroom was upstairs, and I could hear the faint sound of my father's snoring, a sound that had always annoyed me but now seemed like the most beautiful music in the world. It was normal, human, alive. I made my way to my room without turning on any lights, not wanting to wake anyone or have to explain why I was home so late. The familiar surroundings should have been comforting, but instead they felt strange and alien, as if the encounter in the cornfield had changed something fundamental about the way I perceived the world. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared out the window at the night beyond. The street was empty, lit by the familiar orange glow of sodium vapor lights, and everything looked exactly as it should. But I knew that somewhere out there, in the darkness between the towns and the cities, things were moving that had no business existing in the world I thought I knew. The tears came without warning, hot and bitter and filled with a despair I couldn't name. I wasn't crying because I was sad. I was crying because I was terrified, because I'd seen something that had fundamentally altered my understanding of reality, and because I knew that no one would ever believe me if I tried to tell them what had happened. I curled up on my bed fully clothed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me. But even those comforting noises couldn't drown out the memory of the thing's hollow gaze, or the wet sounds it had made as it moved, or the cold alien presence that had brushed against my mind like the touch of something that should have been dead. Sleep, when it finally came, was filled with nightmares of cornfields and hollow eyes and creatures that moved like shadows given form. And in every dream I was running, always running, but never fast enough to escape the thing that was following me through the darkness. Dawn came like a judgment, gray and cold and unforgiving. I hadn't really slept, just dozed fitfully between nightmares, starting awake every time I heard a sound that might have been footsteps or breathing or something moving through the corn that existed only in my fractured dreams. The morning light filtering through my bedroom window should have been reassuring, but instead it only served to make the previous night's events seem more surreal, more impossible. I lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself that it had all been a dream. The rational part of my mind was working overtime, offering explanations that became more desperate with each passing moment. Stress from the prom cleanup, exhaustion from staying up too late, the disorientation of driving unfamiliar roads in the dark. Anything except the possibility that I'd actually encountered something that shouldn't exist. But even as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, I knew I was lying to myself. The memory was too vivid, too detailed, too consistent. I could still feel the cold, alien presence that had brushed against my mind, still see the hollow eyes that had stared at me from across the broken asphalt. Whatever I'd encountered in that cornfield, it had been real, and it had left its mark on me in ways I was only beginning to understand. The smell of bacon and coffee drifted up from the kitchen, and I realized that my parents were already up and moving around. The thought of facing them, of pretending that everything was normal, filled me with a dread that was almost as intense as what I'd felt the night before. How could I sit at the breakfast table and make small talk about the weather when I just witnessed something that challenged every assumption I'd ever held about the nature of reality? I forced myself to get up and look out the window at the driveway below. My truck was parked exactly where I'd left it, and in the morning light it looked perfectly normal, just another beat-up F-15 that had seen better days. But I knew that if I looked closely, I'd find evidence of what had happened, damage that couldn't be explained by normal wear and tear, or a simple fender bender. The thought of examining the truck filled me with a mixture of dread and compulsion. I needed to know if the damage was real, if there was physical evidence to support what I'd experienced. But I also dreaded what I might find, because proof would mean that I couldn't dismiss the encounter as a hallucination or a dream. I got dressed and went downstairs, trying to act as normal as possible. My parents were in the kitchen, my father reading the newspaper while my mother cooked breakfast. They looked up when I entered, and I forced myself to smile and mumble something about being tired. "How was the cleanup?" my mother asked, flipping a pancake with practiced ease. "Fine," I managed, pouring myself a cup of coffee with hands that I hoped weren't shaking too badly. Just took longer than expected. My father looked up from his paper. "You got home pretty late. I heard you come in around 2. "Yeah, sorry about that. Had to make sure everything was put away properly." They seemed to accept this explanation, returning to their morning routines without suspicion. But I could barely choke down the breakfast they'd prepared. my stomach churning with anxiety and the lingering effects of adrenaline. Every bite tasted like ash, and I found myself jumping at every sound. The coffee pot gurgling, refrigerator cycling on, the newspaper rustling in my father's hands. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. "I think I'll go check on the truck," I said, standing up abruptly. "Make sure it's running okay after last night." My parents exchanged a look that I couldn't quite decipher. "Is there something wrong with it?" my father asked. "No, just, want to make sure everything's good." I escaped to the driveway before they could ask any more questions, and the morning air hit me like a slap. It was warm and humid, typical for a Virginia summer, but there was something else in the air, a faint organic scent that reminded me of the cornfield and made my skin crawl. The truck looked innocent enough in the daylight, but as I walked around it, I began to notice details that made my blood run cold. The left front fender was crumpled, not badly but enough to be noticeable. The metal was dented inward in a pattern that looked almost like a handprint, or something that might have been a handprint if hands were 3 times larger than they should be and had too many fingers. But it was the damage to the undercarriage that really got my attention. I had to lie down on the driveway and crawl under the truck to see it properly. But what I found there made my mouth go dry. The metal frame was twisted and gouged, as if something incredibly sharp had raked across it. There were scratches in the steel that were too deep, too precise, too deliberate to have been caused by road debris or a simple collision. And there was something else, something that made my rational mind recoil in horror. Caught on one of the twisted pieces of metal was a fragment of what looked like organic material. It was dark and fibrous, like hair or fur, but it had a texture that was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. When I reached out to touch it, my fingers jerked back instinctively as if they'd been burned. The smell was stronger under the truck, that same organic, earthy scent that had been present at the cornfield. But there was something else mixed in with it, something that reminded me of old bones and dried blood and things that had been dead for a very long time. I crawled out from under the truck and stood up, brushing dirt off my clothes with hands that were shaking uncontrollably. The evidence was undeniable. I'd hit something the night before, something that had left physical traces on my truck. But the nature of that damage, the size and shape of the dent, the claw marks on the undercarriage, none of it made sense if I'd simply collided with a deer or a dog or any other normal animal. I spent the rest of the morning in my room, staring out the window and trying to process what I'd discovered. The fragment of organic material was still under the truck, and I knew I should probably remove it, but the thought of touching it again made my skin crawl. There was something fundamentally wrong about it, something that made every instinct I possessed scream in revulsion. The day passed in a haze of anxiety and paranoia. I couldn't concentrate on anything, couldn't hold a conversation, couldn't even watch television without my mind drifting back to the cornfield and the thing that had stared at me with hollow eyes. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats, and I found myself checking the locks on the doors and windows obsessively. As evening approached, I realized that I was terrified of the coming darkness. The thought of night falling, of the world being plunged back into the same conditions that had existed when I'd encountered the thing, filled me with a dread that was almost paralyzing. I'd never been afraid of the dark before, but now it represented something more than just the absence of light. It was a realm where impossible things could exist, where the normal rules of reality didn't apply. I tried to stay awake as long as possible, but eventually exhaustion overwhelmed my fear, and I fell into a fitful sleep filled with nightmares of cornfields, and hollow eyes and creatures that moved like shadows given form. And in every dream I was running, always running, but never fast enough to escape the thing that was following me through the darkness. When I woke up, it was to the sound of something moving outside my window. I lay perfectly still, listening to the soft scraping sound that seemed to be coming from the side of the house. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like something was dragging itself across the siding. My heart hammered against my ribs as I strained to hear more, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I forced myself to get up and look out the window, but the yard below was empty, lit by the pale glow of the streetlights. There was nothing there, no sign of whatever had been making the noise, but I knew what I'd heard, and I knew that it hadn't been the wind or a tree branch or any other normal explanation my mind tried to offer. The thing from the cornfield had found me. I never did learn to drive comfortably at night again. Even now, years later, the thought of being alone on a dark country road fills me with a terror that's as fresh and immediate as it was that night. I've moved away from Virginia, built a life in a city where the streets are always lit and the darkness never feels quite as deep. But I still wake up sometimes to the sound of something moving outside my window. And sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I catch a glimpse of something tall and impossibly thin, something that moves like a shadow and watches me with hollow eyes that seem to see into my soul. I tell myself it's just my imagination, just the lingering effects of trauma, but deep down I know the truth. Some things once seen can never be unseen, and some encounters leave marks that time can never heal. The thing in the cornfield is still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting driver to come along. And sometimes, on dark nights when the moon is hidden and the world seems to hold its breath, I can feel its attention turning toward me across the miles, cold and alien and utterly without mercy. I survived my encounter with the impossible, but I was never the same. The world I thought I knew, the safe, rational world of physics and logic and things that made sense, was revealed to be nothing more than a thin veneer over something much older and more terrible. And once you've seen through that veneer, once you've glimpsed the hungry darkness that lies beneath, you can never quite forget what's waiting out there in the spaces between the streetlights. The cornfield remembers, and so do I. I was driving north from Belfort, South Dakota, aiming to meet a friend near Acolika, Montana. A simple route, nothing too complicated, just miles of two-lane highway and fields dotted with grazing cattle. The afternoon sun had been merciless, beating down on the asphalt until it shimmered like water, and my air conditioning struggled against the oppressive heat that seemed to seep through the very metal of my car. I'm not even sure where to begin because it feels like an odd fever dream stitched together from too many late-night documentaries. But I swear every moment of this happened. Every grotesque detail, every moment of terror that followed, it all unfolded exactly as I'm about to tell you. The landscape had been gradually changing as I drove deeper into Montana. The rolling hills of South Dakota gave way to something more austere, more desolate. Endless stretches of prairie grass swayed in the wind like a golden sea, interrupted only by the occasional weathered barn or cluster of cattle that watched my passage with blank, unblinking eyes. There was something unsettling about their stare, as if they were witnesses to secrets buried in this vast emptiness. I reached the Montana border right after sunset, which in hindsight was my first mistake. I should have arrived before dark. The sky had transformed into a canvas of deep purples and oranges, beautiful but somehow ominous. As the last light faded, the landscape took on an alien quality. The familiar became strange, and what had seemed like peaceful farmland now felt like a vast, unknowable wilderness. The temperature dropped dramatically once the sun disappeared, and I found myself turning on the heater despite the day's scorching heat. The sudden cold felt unnatural, almost aggressive, as if the land itself was rejecting my presence. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, revealing nothing but the endless ribbon of asphalt and the occasional reflective eyes of some creature watching from the roadside. I stopped briefly in Alzada, a tiny unincorporated place that's basically a curve in the road with a bar, a post office, and not much else. The few streetlights cast sickly yellow pools of illumination that seemed to emphasize the darkness rather than dispel it. I'd planned to top off my tank, but the one pump looked out of order. Not just broken, but deliberately sabotaged. The hoses had been cut, and there were scratch marks on the metal casing that looked almost like claw marks. A local fell on a porch across the way, gave me a glance like he'd seen enough strangers for a lifetime. His face was gaunt, deeply lined, and his eyes held a wariness that went beyond simple unfriendliness. He was rocking slowly in an old wooden chair, the creaking audible even from where I stood. When I raised my hand in greeting, he stopped rocking entirely and just stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I had half a tank left, so I figured I'd push on rather than approach him for directions or information. As I walked back to my car, I noticed that every window in the small cluster of buildings was dark except for one. In the post office, a single light burned behind dirty glass, and I could swear I saw the silhouette of someone standing perfectly still, watching me. The figure didn't move the entire time I was in view, and when I glanced back from my car it was gone, but the light remained burning. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of something I couldn't identify. Something organic and unpleasant, like meat left too long in the sun. It made my stomach turn and I rolled up my windows quickly. eager to get back on the road and away from this place that felt more like a movie set than a real town. I got back on Highway 323 expecting it to be empty for the next hour or so. The night sky was incredible, an unbelievable spread of stars, the kind that make you feel a little small, but there was something oppressive about that vastness, as if the universe was pressing down on me, reminding me how insignificant I was in this endless expanse of darkness. The road stretched ahead like a black river, and my headlights seemed pitifully inadequate against the overwhelming darkness. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that seemed to dart across the road just beyond the reach of my lights. I told myself it was just jackrabbits or coyotes, but the movements were too fluid, too deliberate. A while later, around 9:30 or so, I spotted a side road that wasn't on my map, just a dirt track cutting off into the darkness. Sometimes I get curious, especially out in Big Sky country. The opening was marked by two weathered fence posts, one tilted at an odd angle as if something had struck it with tremendous force. Hanging from the upright post was what looked like a piece of cloth, but as I slowed down I realized it was something else entirely, a strip of what appeared to be animal hide, dried and blackened with age. I thought maybe it was a scenic overlook or a ranch road that would let me see a different angle of the horizon. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to keep driving, to stick to the main road. But something pulled me toward that dark opening. It was as if the road itself was calling to me, promising answers to questions I didn't even know I had. So I slowed down, turned in, and the moment my tires hit that gravel, it felt like crossing an invisible line. The temperature inside my car dropped several degrees, and my breath began to fog. The radio, which had been playing static-filled country music, suddenly went silent. When I tried to adjust the dial, all I got was a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the car's frame. I drove for about 10 minutes, not really seeing much except silhouettes of distant buttes and the outline of old fence lines. The road was rougher than I'd expected, full of potholes and washouts that made my car bounce and rattle. But it was the silence that got to me most, not the peaceful quiet of a rural night, but a dead oppressive silence that seemed to muffle even the sound of my own engine. The fence lines I passed were strange, constructed not just of wire and posts, but adorned with what looked like bones, bleached white skulls of cattle and smaller animals tied to the posts with leather cords. At first I thought it might be some kind of rustic decoration, but as I passed more of them, I realized they were arranged in patterns, almost like some kind of coded message. Then, I noticed a flicker of light. Just a tiny glow, like a lantern or a campfire off to my left. It was perhaps a quarter-mile away, nestled in a small depression between two low hills. The light seemed to pulse rhythmically, like a heartbeat, and occasionally it would flare brighter before dimming again. I pulled over, shut off my engine, and tried to figure out what I was looking at. The silence was complete now, so profound that I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The light was faint, but it moved a bit, like people were carrying it around. I was debating heading back to the main road when I heard voices, low, hushed, but definitely more than one person. The voices rose and fell in a pattern that wasn't quite speech and wasn't quite singing, something in between that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was an urgency to the sounds, as if whatever was happening was building toward something significant. I couldn't make out the words, if they were words at all, but the tone was unmistakably ritualistic. Maybe it was just a group of ranchers or campers, though it was a strange spot for a camp. The depression where the light flickered was clearly visible now, and I could see it was perfectly circular, as if it had been carved out of the landscape by some massive tool. The walls of the depression were too smooth, too regular to be natural. But there was something unnerving about the way the light danced, bobbing slightly, as if whoever was holding it was pacing in a tight circle. My gut told me to leave, but my curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed my flashlight and walked maybe 50 yards closer, half crouching behind some scraggly sagebrush. The wind was picking up, swirling dust around my ankles, and carrying with it that same nauseating smell I'd noticed in Alzada, but stronger now, more concentrated. The sagebrush I hid behind was wrong somehow. The leaves were too dark, almost black, and when I touched them they felt oddly warm and slightly moist, as if they were perspiring. The ground beneath my feet was soft, almost spongy, and with each step I felt as though I was walking on something that might give way at any moment. That's when I saw more lights flick on, several lanterns or flashlights, revealing about a dozen figures in dark flowing robes. They stood in a rough circle around something that looked like a low wooden table or maybe a crude altar. The robes weren't just dark, they seemed to absorb light, creating human-shaped voids in the flickering illumination. The fabric moved in ways that didn't match the wind, rippling and undulating as if alive. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. The chanting was soft, rhythmic, but now I could hear it clearly. It wasn't English, wasn't any language I recognized. The syllables were harsh, guttural, with sounds that seemed to come from deep in the throat. They reminded me of the death rattle of some dying animal, but sustained and purposeful. I noticed a heavy smell in the air, like burning hair or something foul, and I had to stifle a gag. The odor was so thick I could taste it, metallic and rotten, coating my tongue and throat. It was the smell of corruption, of something that had been dead for far too long. I know how it sounds, like some B-movie plot, but I was there, crouched behind a bush, fighting the urge to run. The altar at the center of the circle was carved from what looked like a single piece of blackened wood, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering light. The wood itself appeared to be bleeding, dark stains that dripped steadily onto the ground below. The group parted slightly, and I saw an older man in the center holding what appeared to be a carved wooden staff. His face was visible in the lantern light, and I immediately wished it wasn't. His skin was pale, almost translucent, with dark veins visible beneath the surface. His eyes were completely black, not just the pupils but the entire eye, like looking into deep wells. When he smiled, his teeth were filed to points, and his tongue was an unnatural shade of purple. He lifted the staff, and I could see it was carved from the same dark wood as the altar, covered in the same writhing symbols. At its top was what looked like a human skull, but wrong too elongated with too many teeth. The skull's empty sockets seemed to track my movement, following me as I shifted position behind the bush. Then he slammed it down onto the wooden surface with a sound like breaking bones. The chanting stopped dead, and every flashlight and lantern turned toward the direction I was hiding. The silence was absolute, crushing, as if the very air had been sucked away. I have never felt such dread, a terror so complete that it paralyzed me entirely. I ducked lower, half expecting them to charge at me, but they just stood there in utter silence, as if they could sense me but not pinpoint my location. The robed figures were perfectly still, like statues, but I could feel their attention focused on me with laser intensity. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming harder to breathe. The man with the staff raised it again and began to speak in that same guttural language, but louder now, more urgent. As he spoke, the symbols on the altar began to glow with a sickly green light, and I heard a sound like sobbing coming from beneath the ground. The earth around the altar began to bulge upward, as if something was trying to push its way to the surface. I figured if I tried to sprint back to my car, they'd see me for sure. So I inched away, trying to keep my head down. My heart was pounding so hard I was worried they'd hear it. The soft ground made my retreat treacherous. With each step I felt like I might sink into some hidden pit. Just as I got a few yards back, something crunched under my boot. Broken glass maybe, or bones. The sound was like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. The group's lights swept my way, and someone shouted in that same alien language. The voice was inhuman, a screech that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. I froze, but the lights kept moving, scanning the area like searchlights. The beams weren't normal white light. They had a reddish tinge that made everything they touched look like it was covered in blood. Another voice barked something that sounded like an order, and the entire circle started spreading out, moving with an unnatural gliding motion that suggested their feet never quite touched the ground. I took that moment to run. The soft ground that had hindered my retreat now seemed to grab at my feet, as if trying to hold me back. Behind me, I heard a sound like wind through a graveyard, followed by what could only be described as howling, not from dogs or wolves, but from human throats twisted into shapes that shouldn't be possible. By the time I reached my car, dust was swirling everywhere, and the wind was howling. The dust wasn't ordinary, it was thick, almost viscous, and it clung to my skin like oil. Worse, it seemed to move with purpose, forming shapes and patterns that looked almost like faces before dissolving back into chaos. I threw myself in, locked the doors, and fired up the engine. The car struggled to start as if the battery was nearly dead, though it had been fine moments before. When it finally caught, the engine sounded different, rougher, more strained. In the rearview mirror, I could see beams of light moving fast, like they were running, trying to catch me. But it wasn't just the lights that were pursuing me. In the mirror, I caught glimpses of the robed figures themselves, and they weren't running, they were floating, gliding across the ground with their arms outstretched, their robes billowing around them like dark wings. Their faces, when I could see them, were no longer human. They had become something else, something twisted and wrong. I floored it, fishtailing on the gravel before the tires found traction. The car lurched forward, and I heard a sound like claws scraping against metal. Something had nearly caught me. In the side mirror, I saw one of the figures standing in the road behind me, its arm extended as if it had been reaching for my car. Even from a distance, I could see that its hand was wrong, too long, with too many joints. The dirt road seemed to stretch on forever, far longer than it had when I'd driven in. The fence posts with their bone decorations flashed past like a nightmare corridor, and I swore I could hear the skulls chattering as I passed. The road twisted and turned in ways I didn't remember, leading me through landscapes that seemed to shift and change in my headlights. Finally, after what felt like hours but could only have been minutes, I saw the main highway ahead. I sped back toward it, the entire time expecting a truck to appear in my mirrors, but no one followed. When I reached the pavement, I felt a physical sensation of relief, as if I'd crossed some kind of protective barrier. But the relief was short-lived. As I drove toward Ekalaka, I noticed that my fuel gauge was reading nearly empty, though I'd had half a tank when I turned onto the dirt road. The radio was still dead, producing only that strange humming sound. Worse, the temperature gauge was reading dangerously high, though the heater was blowing cold air. I reached Ekalaka around 11 p.m., found a gas station that was thankfully still open, and just sat in my car for a good 15 minutes trying to calm down. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The attendant inside shot me a look that said I probably looked white as a sheet, which I'm sure I did. When I finally went inside to pay for gas, I caught sight of myself in the security mirror behind the counter. I looked like I'd aged 10 years in the past hour. My hair was streaked with that strange dust, and my eyes were bloodshot and wild. There were scratches on my face and arms that I didn't remember getting, thin lines that looked almost like claw marks. I asked the attendant if there were any local groups who do night gatherings, and he just shrugged, said folks keep to themselves around here. But I noticed his hand trembled slightly as he made change, and he kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting to see something outside. I pried a bit more and he muttered something about rumors of robed strangers near Medicine Rock State Park. But that's miles from where I was. He said sometimes ranchers report weird bonfires on remote properties, but no one digs too deep out of fear of stumbling into something they'd rather not see. "You didn't see nothing out there, did you?" he asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. When I hesitated, his face went pale. "Jesus," he said, backing away from the counter.
You did, didn't you? You saw them.
He wouldn't say anything more, just kept shaking his head and muttering under his breath. As I left, I heard him lock the door behind me and saw him pull down the blinds. The gas station's lights went out as I drove away. The next day, I tried to drive back to that area in daylight, but after an hour of searching, I couldn't find that same dirt road. Everything looked the same. Dusty tracks, fence posts, rolling plains. It was like the place had swallowed itself, or perhaps had never existed at all. The landscape seemed normal in the daylight, even pleasant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stopped at every dirt road I could find, but none of them matched my memory. Some were too wide, others too narrow. Some had normal wooden fence posts, others had none at all, but nowhere did I find the tilted posts with their grisly decorations. Nowhere did I find that perfectly circular depression. What disturbed me most was that I began to doubt my own memory. In the harsh light of day, the events of the previous night seemed impossible, like something out of a horror movie. But the scratches on my arms were real. The dust in my hair was real, and my car still smelled of that sickly sweet corruption. That evening at a small motel, I overheard someone talking about cults in the region, how they meet in deserted areas and practice who knows what. It was just casual conversation between truckers, the usual small-town rumors and gossip. But the one time I mentioned seeing robes, the guy's face went pale. He said a relative of his once caught sight of a group wearing dark hoods in the countryside near Baker, Montana. And after that, the relative rarely left home at night. Changed him, the trucker said. Never was the same after. Started talking about things that shouldn't be, about things that live in the spaces between places. The trucker lowered his voice. My relative, he started drawing these symbols, covering the walls of his room with them. Said he had to keep them out, had to remember the pattern so they couldn't follow him home. Found him one morning, dead in his bed, but his face, he shuddered. His face was frozen in a scream, but his eyes were gone. Just empty sockets, like something had reached in and taken them. I left Ekalaka the following morning. telling myself I was just relieved to be putting distance between me and that memory. But I couldn't shake the image of that group standing around that table, or the way they moved like they were rehearsing an old routine, something ancient and practiced. The man with the staff, his black eyes, his pointed teeth. These images haunted me during the daylight hours and invaded my dreams at night. I felt almost guilty for seeing it, like I'd violated a boundary that was meant to keep certain things hidden from the world. There was a sense that I'd witnessed something that humans weren't supposed to see, something that existed in the dark spaces between civilization and wilderness. On my last night in Montana, in a motel near Miles City, I tried to do some quick online searches about robed gatherings in southeastern Montana. Nothing substantial came up, just some talk about fringe religious sects and a few conspiracy theories referencing government cover-ups of desert cults, all too vague to tie anything directly to what I saw. But I did find something that made my blood run cold. In a genealogy forum, someone had posted about their family history in Carter County, mentioning that their great-grandfather had been part of a group that had made contact with the old powers in the 19th. The post described rituals performed in circular depressions, ceremonies designed to thin the veil between worlds. The post had been deleted by the time I tried to read it again an hour later, but I'd saved the text. It mentioned that the group had been successful in their goals, that they'd managed to establish a permanent connection with entities from the spaces between spaces. The great-grandfather had supposedly lived to be 103, never aging past his 40th year, but had paid a price that wasn't specified. I did read an article about missing livestock in Carter County, though, with no culprit found. The article mentioned that the animals weren't just missing, they were found drained of blood, with strange symbols carved into their hides. Local authorities had blamed it on a cult, but no arrests had ever been made. That was enough to make me lose my appetite. I drove straight home the next day, half expecting an unfamiliar vehicle to tail me all the way. Every car that stayed behind me for more than a few miles made me nervous, and I found myself taking random exits and back roads, anything to make sure I wasn't being followed. But the paranoia didn't end when I reached home. I started having dreams about the ritual, but in my dreams I was inside the circle, standing at the altar with the skull-top staff in my hands. I could feel the power flowing through it, could understand the meaning of the symbols that covered its surface, and I liked it. I woke up from these dreams with scratches on my arms, just like the ones I'd gotten that night in Montana. Sometimes I'd find myself drawing symbols in the margins of newspapers or on napkins, patterns that looked disturbingly familiar. I'd throw them away immediately, but the compulsion to draw them grew stronger each day. I'm sharing this because it's been eating at me, consuming my thoughts and invading my dreams. If anyone else traveling through southeastern Montana encountered something like that, I'd feel less insane. The robed figures, the chanting, the abrupt hush, the man with the pointed teeth and black eyes, it all still wakes me up in cold sweats. It's not like I can tell a friend or coworker about this without sounding like I made up a ghost story. But I'm telling you, I was there. I heard them. I saw things that shouldn't exist. And I think they almost caught me that night. But more than that, I think they marked me somehow. The scratches keep appearing, and the dreams keep getting more vivid. Sometimes I find myself speaking words in that guttural language, understanding their meaning even though I've never heard them before. I've started avoiding mirrors because sometimes, just for a moment, my reflection shows someone else, someone with black eyes and pointed teeth. If something like this has happened to anyone else, or if folks around there know more about these gatherings, let me know. Maybe the less we keep these things in the dark, the better. But I'm starting to wonder if some things are meant to stay hidden, if some knowledge is too dangerous to share. Because whatever I saw that night, whatever I witnessed in that circular depression, it wasn't just a ritual, it was an invitation. And I'm afraid I might be starting to accept it.